This is the large building I'm about to draw freehand for you. Sadly, it's one of those beautiful old architectural gems which is no longer with us. But as I draw this, slightly speeded up, I'll be explaining both the way I'm thinking, the decisions I make, the order in which I do things, but also the priorities that I keep in my head as the most important things to pay attention to. And it may encourage some of you to know that I didn't quite get it right the first time. In fact, I abandoned the first go of this drawing after about an hour's work. So at the end of the video, I'll show you my first take and explain what went wrong if you're interested in seeing that. You'll have to hang around till the end if you want to catch that. So let's start drawing. Where to start a large and complex subject is a question I'm often asked. I always choose the easiest spot to start. With a freehand drawing, the first things we draw are so important because they will set the scale and ultimately the size of what we're doing. So we want to choose something that's as simple as possible. Choosing something that's in the center of the building means I don't have to worry about trying to draw such extreme angles right at the start. I also go a lot more slowly at the start because this is where I am establishing that first section. And for me, I'm thinking of this front corner, sort of where you've got the 2 windows to the left and the 3 windows to the right. I'm going to draw that first. And once I've drawn that, that's going to be, if you like, my measuring stick for everything else I draw. So I really want to make sure I get it right, proportion-wise. And particularly having done the 2 windows to the left, I want to get the 3 windows to the right in the correct proportion. If you pay attention to my line work, you'll see that I often correct my lines, particularly the perspective lines. If they're not quite right, I make them right. Because in a drawing such as this, the most important thing, the biggest priority in my thinking when I draw this is that the perspective angles have to look right at the end. If they're too steep, it will look silly. If they're not steep enough, the building's going to go on forever. So you'll see me constantly measuring the perspective angle with my pen. And unless this is the first video of mine you've watched, you'll know that's my normal method. I hold the pen against the angle on the paper and then slide it across to the paper. And I might do that 2 or 3 or even 4 times, particularly for important angles that are fairly extreme. As the drawing progresses, this becomes less onerous a task. All the horizontal lines in the building have to line up with the perspective angles, not just the top and bottom. If I'm going to put window pane struts going across the windows that line up horizontally, then they have to fit the perspective pattern exactly. Now the bottom half of this section magically appeared because I turned the camera off to get a drink and forgot to turn it back on. It was a bit of a tricky bit to do because you've got several sections stepping out towards the bottom. It's important though that as well as getting the building perspective right, we get the stonework decorative elements right, because they're an important part of how this building looks and they're important in distinguishing the upper and lower section of the building. Now I do these 2 upper windows that are on the roof line of the building, and it's important to put them in the right place. As well as getting the perspective angles correct in a building such as this, it's really important to get the foreshortening correct. The foreshortening is the principle that things visually compress the further away they get. So if we look to the right of our building, we can see that the gaps between the windows and the columns get narrower and narrower the further away it becomes. The columns get narrower and narrower. Everything gets narrower and narrower as the building moves away from us. And this is a great indicator of both the size of the building and the distance it is from us. And if we don't get these right, the building will simply become too long. And either we'll have to lessen the perspective to accommodate it, or the perspective lines will get too close together and we'll be trying to squeeze windows in where there's not room to squeeze windows in. So it's very important to pay a lot of attention. And this is why, because of the foreshortening, that you'll see that when I do horizontal lines, as I've just done at the top of the left here, I don't actually take them very far because it's pen and I can't erase it. Sometimes we can hide light lines that we've taken too far, or we can just leave them and they're not so bad. But it's better to not draw them in the first place. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm keeping my lines short anticipating that I can add a little bit to them if I need to. And I find that with foreshortening in a building like this, the lines are never as long as I think they're going to be. The other thing that I've done now, once I finish this front corner section, which was in a 0.5mm pen, I switched to a 0.3mm pen. So the rest of this drawing is going to be with a lighter line, and that'll give the effect of that front corner coming further forward. And as I move further away from this corner, I'm also drawing with a lighter touch with the detail that we'll look at later. Not as much on this side, but particularly when we do the right-hand side, which goes much further away. There's much more suggestion of detail than actually drawing it. I like to colour the windows in because they help establish the sense of a building, and particularly also they show if I've got the foreshortening correct. All these little overhanging corner spits, it's important to actually pay attention to the fact that they come out a long way past the corner. Not just on the cornices at the top, but also on the decorative architectural bands at other points where the balustrade is, lower down near the footpath. There's a pattern there of how they overhang and where they line up with the vertical lines. And if we pay attention when we're drawing them and we seek to see the pattern, it's a lot quicker to draw. Now again, I'm doing another one of these little roofline windows, one that's halfway down this corner. There I am. It's a good look at me measuring the angles with my pen. It's surprisingly accurate. You'll notice that just as I did that upper story first, because the perspective was less extreme, I do that story first when I extend the building out, and then I use that as means of alignment to draw the lower part that has the most extreme angle. I pay a lot of attention to the proportions, and while I move out window by window, I also make a point of looking at, say, that center section that's stepped back, and I compare it in my reference to, is that more millimeters or less millimeters than the two windows in the corner section? And then when I do the final section of two windows, I think, well, is that half the width of the first two windows, or a third, or 2/3? It gives me a chance to get a bigger picture sense of how far along these windows go, and helps me get the foreshortening correct. Now the tops of these mansard towers have to line up with perspective as well. So that's what I'm doing with the pen. I'm just measuring that very little line at the very top front of these towers and make sure the perspective angle between them is correct. Now I can also use my pen not just for perspective lines, but also to get the angle of just odd direction lines, such as the sides of these towers. And now I'm working my perspective lines for the long side, which I always felt was going to be the more challenging side, which was why I did the other side first. Don't start with the hardest part. I'm moving across trying to make sure that I foreshorten correctly. I'm continuing to measure my perspective angles with my pen against the reference, but it does start to get easier when you start to have longish lines drawn already. If you have a good look, you'll see that the lines aren't completely exactly the same angle, but it's close enough that it's not too much of a problem. What's a bigger problem is if we leave lines that aren't actually correct. They will attract more attention than an extra line that we've left in going slightly the wrong way alongside a line that's correct. Our brain will favour the line that's correct. So they're really the two main challenges at this point, is getting the foreshortening tight enough and keeping those angles approximately correct with the perspective. I don't want to rush to do the tower. I need the roof to align the tower, and I need the parts under the tower to align the tower with. The one thing I really want to do is to try and keep the size of the tower in proportion to the building below. I don't want it to be too narrow. I don't want it to be too squat. I don't want it to go too far up. I want to keep the proportions of the tower to the building as in the reference. So if I draw the lower part of the building first and I work it particularly at the foreshortening, then I can compare where the lines of 3 corners of the tower that I can see in this reference, I can align them with the parts of the building underneath, or at least use them as a good starting point. The detail I'm doing here now is very gestural. This has taken me so much less time in real life to do because I don't have to do nearly as much detail. It doesn't have to be nearly as precise. And what helps is that I'm now fairly familiar with the pattern of the columns and the windows and where things go in and out and the balustrades. And I've worked out a way of drawing things that would have been nice to have had at the start. Just finishing now this final part. I'm still using the 0.3 pen. I haven't switched to a 0.2, which I sometimes might have done. But I am drawing with much lighter, quicker lines, which in effect makes the lines a little more lighter and helps to create the effect that this part of the building is much further away. And creating a sense of distance is, I think, a very important part of drawing architecture because it helps gives us a sense of the grandeur of a large building. If it all ends up looking exactly the same in terms of our line work and our detail and how we draw the details and the thickness of the lines, then somehow it reduces the scale of the building because in real life you don't see further away things as clearly and sharply as closer things. I get my initial lines a bit wrong, and notice I don't let that worry me, and I certainly don't stick with a line that's in the wrong place. What is really important with this tower though are these perspective angles because they're moving quite a bit higher than the ones I've already drawn on the sides of the building, and the higher the horizontal lines go, the more extreme the angle is going to be. And so if I get these correct, it really adds to the dramatic perspective of this view, of the way this building looks from this view. And it indicates that it is a very tall tower because its height impacts the perspective angles significantly. I do want to make sure I capture those. So I put a lot of attention into this. The tower takes me, I slow down a bit for the tower because I've not drawn these elements before, so it's all unfamiliar. So again, it's don't rush what you can't rush. Forgot to put the camera on there, so part of the tower just magically appeared. And now I've got this little domey part on top. It's not straightforward, this. Look to see what the very top aligns with. Always get your center line in. I draw in my center line. I look at the very tip of this. What does it line up with inside the tower? And I just position those lines before I try and draw it and try and imagine lines to that point. And does that look right? As we go higher up the tower, of course, it's also getting further away. So we want to have a lighter touch and become a bit gestural. I have to reposition my paper because I've drawn it a bit larger than I expected to. Is a little bit larger. And now my final part is this roofing line here. And this is where we find out when we do these sorts of details if everything else is in proportion, because things will line up as per the photo or they won't. And I was very pleased that all the little parts of the roof that we get way down here lined up with their perspective lines where they joined on the other side of the tower, and it just looked right. It's almost done, and I decided to put a couple of people in and a footpath in just to make it look a little more like it's grounded. And then that's it, and I'm happy with it. Now, I promised at the start that I'd show you my first attempt at this, which I actually abandoned after an hour because I realized it wasn't giving a very good example. So if you're interested in what sort of mistakes I make, here you are. Now you can see that I was drawing it smaller than I finished up drawing it, but that wasn't the problem. This section began to turn out okay, but as you can see, I kind of messed up down here. I didn't get all the angles quite correct, and I'd finished some of the columns a bit low down, and it finished up looking like a whole lot of building blocks had been stacked there. And then when I did this lower section, the first mistake I made was I took these windows up too high, and I took them up into this band of brickwork here so that they went right up to the cornice above. I didn't draw this long enough in relation to the columns above. And so it ended up being a very squat foundation for the building to stand on. And I actually added a little bit down here that wasn't in the reference photo, trying to create a little more depth so it didn't look silly. And then when I drew the roof, I made these two very fancy dormer windows, I guess they are. I made them too large. And so they overpowered the roof and had the effect of making this roof tower, which was the right size for the building, made it look smaller than it really is. When we change the proportions of various elements, it does affect the overall impact of the other elements, as I was talking about with the tower during the video. So I decided that it really wasn't anything that was going to give a good example to anyone. I hope you find that interesting. Sometimes things just don't work out. But I will say that when I then drew it a second time, I didn't have these problems because I knew what I was having to pay attention for. And that's where experience helps us. And if this was helpful, please comment and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye.